All right, we're starting in the next part of the program. Remember, the question on the table is kind of what's Arlington's vision of itself? Who are we? Where are we going? And one way of addressing that question is what Bob Brosnan is going to talk about. Bob, I think, is a staff person that literally needs no introduction. The very recently retired head of the Department of Planning, Housing, and something, whatever. And he's going to talk about the comprehensive plan for Arlington, which is just that.
Thank you, John. I am going to talk about that, but I want to take a second to detour on a couple of follow-ups from the last presentation, and I want to thank them for the work they did. We heard a lot of, I think, agreement that what we do is pretty good, and that there were some suggestions on both the county side and the school side for things we might do better. And both the staff on the school side and the county side are looking at that stuff, and some of it is questions and comments that you all have raised out here tonight. And it may take more resources. So there was built into this idea, not that they come with all the answers to the questions that you all were asking tonight, but that they really look at the methodology we use today and see how good it was, and then make some suggestions for the future. So while it may take some more resources, I think we are very open to some of the suggestions they made. We don't have answers tonight as to which ones exactly we're going to do or not, but a lot of them, made sense to us as we got their comments. So I wanted to make sure you knew that. We're going through budget now. I know the manager has presented the board, or will present the board, with some resource questions or requests for this process, because it is pretty intensive across the board. I mean, Susan Bell and myself were talking about how we used to come up with one easel and somebody would hold up the one poster board or whatever, and we'd write on it. Now we've got all this high-tech stuff. The other thing I want to make sure is the last set of questions and comments that we got, I think we need to be clear once more that we, the county staff and the school staff, are forecasting and projecting different things, and there are no conflicts with our numbers. The county staff does not project school children. So we're not getting that wrong. We're not disagreeing with theirs. And they don't forecast population. They don't forecast number of units. They don't forecast employment. So the question really is, and this is one of the recommendations for futures, how can we better combine our data to address some of the things that you all are rightfully talking about? How can we project? Someone said we didn't want to use the word millennials, but that is one of the big issues for us. Is for us on a forecasting perspective, are they going to stay here? Are they going to occupy units? Are they going to have children? And the same question for the schools. That is really a matter of us continuing to monitor trends as time goes on. That's why we do a forecast annually. Schools update theirs regularly. So I just wanted to make sure. I think the last time we made presentations, there may have been some different time frames which made things look different, but we're not projecting even the same. We're projecting different things. And they use our data, the schools uses our data as one of the inputs into their projections as opposed to our forecasts. So with that as kind of a closure to the first presentation, let me talk a little bit about what I'm going to talk about tonight. I want to review Arlington's planning vision since the 1970s. This is something that's come up quite often in the roundtables and in this meeting here. I want to talk about how that vision is implemented. I won't get into too much detail, and hopefully I won't bore you with it. I also want to talk a little bit about the overview of our planning framework, how we do things, and then briefly review results. So what I'm really going to try to get you is an image of where we're going and how we're going to get there. And I think we feel that's really important aspect of the overall charge that you have as a group. So some of the takeaways you're going to get out of, hopefully you're going to get out of my presentation, we'll see how well I do, is how the county consciously decided to use transit and well-planned growth to revitalize the community. I'm going to review some of the planning efforts in the 1970s, and actually, ironically, you're going to hear some of the same issues that are coming around again now, maybe from a different angle that were faced in the 70s. The core elements of this vision was to encourage growth generally within a quarter mile of each of the metro station areas, and then to preserve the community, especially the single-family neighborhoods. And we in the county have always kind of called that our contract with the community. I want to give you a brief description of the comprehensive plan, what it is, how it's used, the difference between the comprehensive plan and zoning, because that's very critical, how other plans that the county does fits into this, and then last, a little bit of how well it's worked, some of the benefits, and kind of answering the question, well, why did we do this? So, setting the stage, in the late 60s, Arlington was a pretty healthy community. There was 7.5 million square feet of office. That was mostly reflective of the government spreading out outside of the core of Washington, D.C. We were seeing declining retail corridors because that's as the region started to build highways and build shopping centers further out. The retail was going further out because that was the cool thing to do. And a lot of the housing in the region was following that. Not that Arlington was losing population, but a lot of the regional housing was following that. As I mentioned, there was an emerging market for government office space. We had strong single-family neighborhoods. They were occupied by a certain generation of folks, and that's one of the issues we'll address as we go forward. There were a large number of garden apartments, some of which were beginning to show a little bit of decline. And these are mostly garden apartments that were built. They're small. They were built during the war or immediately after the war for the influx of people coming into the Washington, D.C. region, almost typically by themselves, so they were small units. We did have 97,000 jobs and about 71,000 housing units. So it wasn't like we were a dying suburb, but there were some issues that were beginning to emerge. Because this is always kind of fun, I wanted to show you some images so you kind of get a sense of what Arlington used to be. This was Roslyn with the oil storage tanks and things like that. And one of the things I always like to say about this is it wasn't much of a gateway into Arlington or to the District of Columbia. Here was one of Courthouse, and this is fairly typical of the retail of the era. Here is one of Sears, and maybe many of you in this room remember how for 10 years or more this sat vacant, and there was a tire store at the back of a lot of parking lots, and I think the garden center continued, but the basic store sat vacant. This was Virginia Square, and then this was our Parkington with the Jerry Lewis Marathon, or what, telethon sign that was always up there. So, Arlington was, again, healthy, but it had to look to the future, and this was the 70s. We were beginning to think about where we should go in the future. And so we started focusing on the year 2000. What were some of the concerns that were coming up even in the 70s? Well, it was a declining population, not an increasing population. Declining school enrollment instead of increasing school enrollment. Declining shopping areas. Rising employment, so what are we going to do with all these workers? Pressures for development because Metro was coming and the region was beginning to grow. Metro Rail was under construction, and then increasing public transportation costs. So some of these are the same issues we're facing today. Some of them are a little bit different. But in the 70s, Arlington started to think about these things. So early planning was 1972. We called it RB 72. And I was not here when that was done, so that's just a rumor some people had at some point. But these are mostly staff-generated land use options for the RB corridor, not Crystal City, but for the RB corridor. And it examined limited growth, balanced growth, and employment growth. I think one of the important aspects of this was that it then fed into the community process, which was to follow, which was the RB, I'll get to it in a minute. But while it wasn't adopted, it did begin to crystallize these two major themes that carry forward throughout all the 70s planning, and I would say carry forward through to today, and that was, once again, the preservation of established single-family and apartment neighborhoods, and the concentration of high-density mixed use near metro station bullseyes of approximately a quarter-mile in radius. So we were really looking at, and this amounts to be about 10% of Arlington in terms of its total land. So we were looking at focusing development in about 10% of Arlington's land to take advantage of the investment that we are going to do in metro and then preserve the balance of the community. And so in 1975, then we began this broad community conversation called the Longrange County Improvement Program. We could have probably come up with a better name. I like our name better. But this was a countywide effort. It looked at other things besides just land use plans for the RB corridor. So it was looking beyond that. And again, several principles came out of that which would guide our future vision going forward. Once again, it's that focus, that growth in the immediate vicinity of metro stations. Encourage growth in these areas, and then Shirlington shows up in here, which was a declining shopping center at that point in time. Encourage the use of transportation and discourage single passenger commuting to and through Arlington. So even in the 70s, we were actively trying to discourage the use of single occupancy vehicles. And then strengthen Arlington's tax base by encouraging growth in the metro station areas, because this was what was going to address those issues that we had identified as to how we're going to pay for all these things as we continue to grow. So these principles came out of the Long-Range Comprehensive Improvement Program, and again, formed the underpinning of our development vision going forward. So based on that, we then began to do sector plans for each one of the stations in the RB corridor. And these really were a more detailed look at this quarter-mile radius around the metro stations. And it really, every one of them, spent a great deal of time talking about the transitions to these single-family neighborhoods that were adjacent so that there would be preservation. Certainly it was recognized there may be traffic impacts and other things, but we even tried to address those. But the transitions in terms of density, height, and uses were pretty carefully addressed in those plans. And then these were further refinements on those broad land use plans that had been done for the corridor. So again, we're moving forward with focusing on this development in the close proximity to the metro stations. So by the end of the 70s, as we finished the corridor planning, we finished the long-range comprehensive improvement plan planning, we really came out with 4 core visions going forward. 1, concentrate high and mid-density redevelopment around transit stations, highly focused on the quarter mile, and then taper down to existing neighborhoods. Some of the sector plans, I think, started talking about tapering up to the core as opposed to tapering down, but the same idea. Encourage a mix of uses and services in the station area, and I'll talk later about why that was important. Create high-quality pedestrian environments and enhanced open space, and then preserve and reinvest in these residential neighborhoods. Those processes were taking us to about year 2000. In 1986, there was a Future of Arlington group that was put together to kind of see where we were and where we were going. And once again, it was kind of interesting to see some of the issues that were being addressed. But this was a broad-reaching process that addressed goals for the entire county again. And one of the primary assumptions was that the current general land use plan and transportation plan, which were adopted after extensive public discussion in the 70s, parenthetically, will be followed. So even in 1986, when we came back to do another countywide visioning, it embraced the same development that came out of the 70s, the same plans that came out of the 70s. Some of the interesting issues at this point were that we were still seeing a decline in school enrollment. We actually had a higher population of adult education programs than we did in the schools. And I think this is actually probably a hint on what's been going on since then, which is this reflected an aging population in the single-family homes, and it was before it began to tip to what we're seeing now. But the schools at the same time were getting old and needed to be maintained and rebuilt, and so there was concerns about where the money was going to come for that. and there was concerns about where now we had rising population instead of declining population, so there was continuing concerns about where we should put that and where the employment growth should go. So some of the same issues we keep coming back to in all these planning efforts, and again, we're revisiting some of it, revisiting some of it now. Okay, so that's a real brief overview of our planning history and focusing on what the development vision is for the county. What I want to talk about next is, okay, how did we implement this? One of the key ways to do that is called the comprehensive plan. And in Arlington, it consists of 10 elements. I won't go through all of them. Not all of them are directly affect the development, although most of them are somehow touching on that. But they consist of the ones you can see on this list here. And by the way, before I clicked, I noticed there will be a new element adopted, hopefully in July, which will be the affordable housing. At least the hope is the affordable housing plan will be adopted in July as an element of the comprehensive plan. This is important because the comprehensive plan gives us certain authorities under the state code to do things we want to do, so it's important to get these things into a comprehensive plan. So as I said, Arlington's comprehensive plan is made up of elements. One of the interesting issues that raises, and I think I've heard this in this group, or I've heard back in some of your other groups that this issue has come up, is other jurisdictions, not all of them, but many other jurisdictions have a comprehensive plan. They don't have 10 elements. They got one comprehensive plan, and a lot of the potential conflicts or the potential different uses for resources or different goals are worked out in the development of that comprehensive plan and the adoption of that comprehensive plan. As I've already laid out for you, Arlington reviews and updates individual elements. So we don't do it as one big comprehensive plan. And so this can lead to competing elements between the plans. Where do we tend to resolve that? We tend to resolve that at either the sector plan level or in our development review or site plan process, which I'm going to talk about. So that's how we operate a little bit differently than some of the other jurisdictions. It doesn't mean that when the other jurisdictions get to development decisions, there aren't some competing priorities or potentially conflicting goals. But they do have one comprehensive plan. We have 10 elements. Okay, the primary one that guides development is the general land use plan. It is our primary policy guide for future development. It's important to note that it is not law, it is policy. It establishes the county's overall character and extent and location of various land uses. It guides the county board's decisions on future development. And it is one of those components of the county's comprehensive plan. And here you can see a copy of it. Important, and I want to repeat this, the general land use plan guides the county board's decision on rezoning and approval of special exceptions, including site plans. So it is the Bible, if you will, for where development's going to take place. We do develop other plans. We do sector plans. I've mentioned those, Clarendon, Ballston. We do revitalization plans. Columbia Pike has a revitalization plan. Cherrydale and Lee Highway has a revitalization plan. I see you looking at me. I think Lee Highway hopes to have a revitalization plan, but they don't yet. We also do small area plans, things like Quincy Street and things like that. So these are further refinements, kind of drilling down from the general land use plan to a finer, small area where we can work out in more detail transportation issues, park open space issues, things like that. All right, the main implementing tools for the general land use plan, it's the zoning ordinance and map, CIP, capital improvement program plan, and subdivision ordinance. I'm not going to talk about CIP and subdivision ordinance too much. I'll mention subdivision ordinance at one point. I know that a lot of the schools folks are very familiar with the school's capital improvement plan process. I don't know how many are familiar with the county's process. The zoning ordinance and map, one of the important things about them is they are law. So I mentioned general land use plan is policy, zoning is law. While the GLUP looks to the future, zoning indicates what specific uses are allowed on property. In addition to use, zoning typically establishes what one can do with their property, such as how big it can be, massing, density, coverage, how tall, height, how much parking must be provided, setbacks from other property lines and/or other structures. So it deals with what you can put on property and how you can fit it on the property. And again, it is law. In Arlington, we have a very close relationship between the general land use plan categories and the zoning ordinance. While you can't read it, you can see all the colors on the right-hand side of the general land use plan, and it tells you very specifically what zoning districts are compatible with each one of those land use categories. A few of them have a couple of districts in them, but most of them have just one district that's compatible with it. So generally, if a rezoning request is not consistent with the land use plan, this is how we really control development to this 11% of the county. If it's not consistent with the general land use plan, we either will not consider it or we will consider it now subject to a special process that the Planning Commission gets involved with called a special general land use plan study. So it's no longer, this project looks cool, let's rezone it and approve it. There's a conscious process to look at the land use plan and what its impact would be. Since the GLUP is policy, and sorry if I roll into GLUP instead of general land use plan, but it's just easier for me to say. Since the GLUP is policy, this is not a required practice, but it's one that we've assumed, and as I say, it really helps us manage and control growth to this 11% of the land where we want the growth to be. It's important to know in Arlington that there are 4 forms of zoning. One is by right. Most of you who live in single-family neighborhoods, that's what you operate under. If you comply with the zoning ordinance, you can get a permit and build, and you just got to have your permit from zoning, and you have to have your permit approved by the building official for its safety of the structure, and you build. Site plan is a special exception requiring the approval of the county board. That's how we do most of our high-density and mixed-use development. We do have a limited form-based code. It's only for Columbia Pike. It's now for the entire Pike, and this is a different form where it is really focuses on the form of the development rather than use, and it talks about where things should be as opposed to not having things and where things shouldn't be. It requires build 2 lines. It establishes height, and if you want to know more about it, Jennifer Smith can talk about it later on. And then we have a use permit, and this really applies to certain uses that might have incompatible impacts on adjacent properties without review and conditions. In Arlington, it's typically live entertainment, child care use permits, drive-through restaurants, schools, and a few other things. So those also have to be approved by the county board. Generally, the difference between a use permit and a site plan is a use permit, there's no authority for the board to modify things, and a site plan, as I'll explain in a little while, there is the ability for the board to modify things. The Arlington County Zoning Ordinance allows site plans in certain districts. The state code specifically enables special exceptions and specifically enables incentive zoning. And so how we do our site plans in Arlington is as incentive zoning. And I'll explain a little bit more about what this means. So in the underlying zoning for each one of the site plan districts, there's a very limited by right development that could happen. Nobody ever builds on that because while most of you don't have any idea what 0.6 FAR means, I think you can understand that 0.6 FAR is a whole lot less than 3.8 FAR, whatever it is. That's one of the ways we get people to play by our rules and build where we want what we want. So the site plan allows the board to approve up to this next level, in this case, in this example, 3.8 FAR, and then on top of that, the board does have authority to approve some bonuses. The site plan builds in flexibility to modify such things as parking. Parking is cut in half and sometimes eliminated entirely. Height, setback, coverage. So unlike the by right, which the zoning administrator has no authority to modify things, site plans, the county board has a great deal of authority to modify things. However, it's not without some level of control. One, site plans require extensive community review and county board approval, so they go through a fairly extensive site plan review committee process. Communities involved, planning commissions involved, and other commissions are involved. The standards under which they are reviewed are included in both the zoning ordinance, the general land use plan, sector plans, and other county policies. So when we start to review them, we bring all these policies together. So you remember I mentioned that we'll start to resolve potential conflicting goals in the large plans at the site plan level. So we start to begin to do the trade-offs at the site plan level. This often requires a delicate balancing among often competing interests. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this also comes up a lot about what does the community get out of site plan. So I mentioned there's a small level of by right, and then there's this, in the example you saw, 3.8 FAR, called a standard site plan density. And there's a whole lot of public improvements that we require for the developer to get up to that standard. It's maintenance of streets, it's putting in new streets, it's sidewalks, it's a lot of our TDM requirements, it's underground and utilities, it's other features shown in our sector plans. So again, this is how we apply the sector plans. I mentioned, however, that there's also bonuses available, and this is when we jump up to a higher level of expectations. This is where additional affordable housing will be looked for, or additional green building investment, contribution to community facilities, and other desired features. So that's just a quick way of showing how we implement site plans. Now, site plans, as I mentioned, generally allow flexibility. The requirements are set forth in the zoning ordinance, and the flexibility and limitations are also set forth in the zoning ordinance. So the board does not have unlimited authority in most cases. There are limitations set forth in the zoning ordinance. And as I've mentioned a couple times already, guidance is also provided by the GLUP sector plans and other area plans. Now, this is a question that's come up from time to time. Well, if the GLUP says this or sector plan says this, doesn't it have to be done? No. Remember I mentioned that the plans are not law, they're policy. So the zoning ordinance is really the driver in this. The others are policy that are taken into consideration. So the underlying plans do not have to be amended if site plans vary from the whatever plan element that it might seemingly conflict with. Again, that goes through a lot of community discussion, a lot of community process, and full county board hearings and planning commission hearings. So it's not like it sneaks through. There are a lot of trade-offs in it, but the underlying plans do not have to be modified if they're not fully complied with. Nonetheless, we do try to comply with them almost 100%. So I want to reiterate that the hierarchy of these plans is the zoning is the law. That sets forward the limitations that the board has, and often sets maximums on things like height, density, and stuff like that. Comprehensive plan, the GLUP, Master Transportation Plan, and other elements, that's the second level. They are policy recognized by the state code as having a high level of strength. And then we use sector and area plans and other plans that we do as further informing and refining, but they fall down at a slightly lower level. Now, increasingly, however, that being said, our sector plans are becoming more prescriptive and less flexible. And how this is done is that we often incorporate elements of the sector plans into the zoning ordinance itself that's adopted after the plan is approved. So, for example, in Clarendon, when the sector plan was approved, there were height maps approved by the board. Those height maps were actually moved into the zoning ordinance, and so they become law. And the board cannot modify those other than amending the ordinance, which is never a really easy task. So there has been a move to kind of really set some parameters even within the plans that get directly incorporated into zoning. As I mentioned, amending the zoning ordinance is a much more difficult process, not to mention that there's hundreds of zoning ordinance amendments that the county board is interested in having staff take a look at. This is a bit of a side step for a moment, but the last time I think Susan was up answering some questions that people had about what's going on in the single-family neighborhoods. This is something that people have recognized as a part of the school boom, if you will, that development's taking place in the single-family neighborhoods. So what I want to reiterate once again is that that development is by right. And you know, we're going through a market phase, if you will, where a lot of times houses are being torn down, being replaced by a bigger house. That is by right. That's not activity the county is actively involved with promoting, putting on the land use plan, or any other way. There are some constraints on what can be done, but that is, it is a by right activity. And it's also guided partially by the subdivision ordinance, and that's where you will see sometimes these large lots re-subdivided into 2 lots, on occasion 3 lots. That is not the county rezoning this area to up the density. That is, by right, someone's decided that I've lived on 3 lots for all my life, I'm going to sell and chop it into 3, and a builder is going to build it. So I just thought that was an important point to point out. So how have we done with this plan of trying to concentrate development in the metro station areas, try to generate a ridership on transit, and to try to get economic vitality to help support schools, parks, maintain our roads and other things? Well, I showed you the images earlier, and this is what Roslyn has become. I mean, I think you know it, but sometimes you don't see the aerials that help reinforce it. And this is what Ballston was, and this is what Ballston has become today. And another interesting aspect, this was Ballston from an aerial, and actually the bus stations were in there, but the metro station wasn't yet in this aerial. And then this is where it is today. So certainly from just the perspective of buildings going up, whether you think they're good or not, there was a lot of success for the plans that were put in place in the 70s. It has, in the 70s, there are 22,000 jobs, 5.5 million square feet of office, 7,000 housing units, and today there are, in 2009, there were 98,500 jobs, 21.7 million square feet of office, and 28,000 housing units. So a lot of growth. One of the important things I like to point out for this is if you think of a housing unit as about 1,000 square feet, which is probably on the low end, although today it's probably right about where we're seeing them, that's pretty much 21 million square feet of office and 28 million square feet of residential. So there's we tried to have a good mix of residential and office, and you can see over the years, 40 years later, that mix has really come about, and it's important from a variety of perspectives. I wanted to show this because it really reinforces, I think, how little of the area of the county this growth is taking place in. So throughout the entirety of both corridors, we have 34 million square feet of office, 41,000 housing units, about 5.3 million square feet of retail, and 126,000 jobs. Again, in an area that represents about 11% of the county and is all served by transit. Where are we going? Elizabeth presented you with numbers previously, but what I wanted to reinforce here is that most of the projected growth, virtually all of the projected growth, as you can see by the darker colors, again is projected into those 2 corridors, or that 10 to 11% of the land. So where we are today and where we're going to be tomorrow is pretty much the same. It's going to be a little bit bigger, but it's going to be located in the same areas. Now, we set out to do all this planning to take advantage of Metro and to get ridership. And so what you'll see here is out, and again, probably can't read the numbers. I think the presentation is online, so you can look at the numbers in more detail. And if you've ever seen Dennis Leach's presentations, he uses these numbers also. But this really just goes to show you how our ridership has been steadily increasing over the years. I mentioned that this balanced growth was important, and it's important for a variety of reasons, one of which is in a system that we have at Metro with constraints on expanding service and constraints on maintaining and increasing new cars and things like that. The balanced transportation is very important. So in Arlington, many of the Metro stations have about as many people going in rush hour as coming out. So this really balances, not everybody, if you live out in at the end of Orange Line, or you try to get on East Falls Church, it can be hard to get on. But when you get into the core of Arlington, as many people are coming and going both ways. But that mix is also important from an economic vitality perspective, because that mix in these station areas helps support retail, helps support other things that generates the taxes that we need to help support the rest of the community. So we've really discovered that this mixed-use development that we've achieved is really important from the 2 perspectives. One of the other goals out of the LRCIP was to enhance walkability, and so what this shows you is that, and the percentages, 73% of the people arriving, this was in 2008, I don't think it's been updated recently, in Boston arrive on foot. So we're not a commuter rail system where people are driving. There certainly is a moderate amount of people driving or being dropped off, but we've been able to achieve the pedestrian access that we really wanted. Also importantly, we wanted to discourage single occupancy vehicle trips. And what this shows you is despite that 34 million square feet of development that I talked about, the traffic in the corridors has actually gone down. Now, I know on some situations I've been in, people have disputed that a little bit just anecdotally, but the numbers do show that it's actually decreased. So with all this development, we've been able to encourage economic growth and yet not encourage increased traffic. I took the slide out that shows you how the regional routes are continuing to go up as Arlingtons go down. Part of that has to do, I'm sure, with how we manage our transportation facilities. And then again, apropos to the discussion we're in, $27.5 billion of our total $57.5 billion in assessed land and improvements value is in this 11% of the land. So almost half of our total tax revenue, or tax assessed revenue, is in 11% of the land of Arlington County. So that's besides the 50-50 mix we have, that's just incredible. And today, Arlington has more office space than downtown Dallas, Los Angeles, Denver, and Boston. So I hope that I've showed you where we were trying to go in the 70s, that we've been consistently trying to get there, how we've tried to get there, and I think showed that there are certainly strong elements of success that will bode well for our future. And I think with that, John, we're going to open up to
Bob, I
questions.
think what we're going to do is ask Susan to make her presentation, and then we'll take questions for either or both of them so we can make sure we get all of the citing material into the presentation tonight.